that's just me, y'all. I don't control my own emotions when I need to, but when I don't need to, I've got absolute control. So we're in Esther chapter 1. I want to introduce you to someone who you may know. If you've been around church a long time, this story is one that you know. It's very familiar. And we're going to go through Esther in 5 weeks. There's 10 chapters in Esther. We're going to take 2 chapters a week, except for 1 week we're only going to do 1, and another week we're going to do 3. So you decide which weeks those will be. I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to skip the one we do 3. But Esther is a very familiar story, but I still want to introduce you to Hadassah. Hadassah is a Jewish woman. She is born in exile. So to tell you about Hadassah, introduce you to her, I've got to introduce you to the people that she's from, the Jewish people. The Jewish people are made up of 2 tribes, the tribe of Judah and Benjamin. And they were once a part of a kingdom of 12 tribes, but because of the lack of wisdom in Solomon's son, the kingdom divided, and Benjamin and Judah were set apart in the south from the northern kingdom of Israel, which was constituted of the other 10 tribes. And the king of the north was afraid that if the people of the north were to go to Jerusalem to worship, Jerusalem was located in the territory of Benjamin, if they were to go there to worship, that they might rejoin Judah, and then they wouldn't have their own kingdom anymore. So to avoid that, they built 2 altars, one in the north in Dan, and one in the south in Bethel, so the people of Israel would have a place to worship on their own. And in both places, they put up a golden calf. So the people would go and worship God at the image of the golden calf at either Dan and Bethel. And as you could imagine, there were no righteous kings in Israel. For the full span of their history, every king they had was an idolater, leading the people to follow after false gods. And so Israel was overtaken by the Assyrians. The Assyrians came and they overtook the northern kingdom, and they surrounded Judah, Jerusalem particularly. They surrounded the southern kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem, but the Judeans cried out to God, and God sent panic or something among the Assyrians. The Assyrian army was there one day, and then they were gone the next. Many of them lay dead in the field. And this is not only recorded in the Bible, this is recorded in other historical sources. The Assyrians made it to Jerusalem, but never overtook it. And for some reason, many of them died and they left. So Judah remained. But Judah didn't remain too long, maybe another 150 years or so. The Assyrians eventually were overtaken by the Babylonians. The Assyrians were wicked and violent and tortuous to the people that they conquered. And the Babylonians overtook them and conquered them and then became the reigning power in the area. And the Babylonians were much more generous to the people that they conquered, but not so much that they would just let people do whatever they wanted. So now the Babylonians are in power, and the Babylonians eventually overtake Judah. They conquer Judah. They pillage the temple. They take all of the best of Israel, well, the best of Judah. It's not Israel anymore. They take the best of Judah back to Babylon, including many of the Judean people, the Jews. So many Jews are exiled. Some remain, but the best and brightest, they're all exiled to Babylon. And they spend 70 years in exile, most of that in Babylon. But after about, I don't know the exact time, I should know it, but I've already forgotten it since I looked at it yesterday. It's okay. After a period of time, the Persians overtook the Babylonians. And while the Babylonians were more generous to the people they conquered than the Assyrians, the Persians were even more generous to the people they conquered than the Babylonians. And so when the Persians overtook the Babylonians, they had a king whose name was Cyrus, and Cyrus declared that the Jews could go home. Not only could they go home, they could go rebuild the temple. And not only could they go rebuild the temple, they could rebuild the city, Jerusalem. They could rebuild its walls. And so you know that happens in Ezra, Nehemiah. That Cyrus makes the declaration. Ezra goes back and begins to build the temple. Well, Cyrus is a king, and then there's two others who have difficult names to say. And then we come to the time of Esther. So we're 3 kings after Cyrus. We are still in Persia, and the king's name is Ahasuerus. And you don't have to say that, except for when you read it in the Bible, but he's also known as Xerxes the First. King Xerxes. He's actually one of the most well-known Persian kings. If you've ever seen the movie 300, and I cannot recommend it to you because of its rating and some of its content, but if you've ever seen it, the Persian king portrayed in that movie is King Xerxes. Xerxes is one of the most well-known Persian kings. And he's followed by other ones. And I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong about the 300 movie, just know that I'm wrong about stuff that doesn't matter. That may be Xerxes the Second, because Xerxes the First isn't the only Xerxes, and that gets really difficult for me to remember. But he ends up being followed by Artaxerxes. The temple is actually completed when Artaxerxes is the king of Persia. So think about how long that took from the time the declaration by Cyrus was made until the temple in Jerusalem was actually completed. There was quite a span of time that was covered. But think about this. While the temple is in the process of being built, the foundations are being laid in Jerusalem, there are still Jews in exile. There's still Jews in Babylon. There are still Jews in Persia, and Hadassah is one. And Hadassah is an orphan. We do know the name of her father, and we'll read it here in a second. We do know the name of her father, but we don't know anything about her father. We don't know anything about her mother. We do know that her cousin's name is Mordecai. In Hadassah, her cousin's name is Mordecai, and Mordecai is much older than her. He's like a father figure in her life. In fact, he is the father figure in her life. Hadassah is an orphan who has been adopted by her cousin, Mordecai. So she lives in his home, and he acts as her father. So here we have an orphan girl in exile living in her cousin's home. If you thought you were going to choose a hero in the Bible, she would not be it. She would not be the one. In the grand scheme of things, if you think you're going to go find a hero today, you're not going to go look for an orphan girl living with her cousin in a country that's not her own. An orphan girl in Persia who's exiled, who's fatherless and motherless, who just has to live under the care of her cousin. She's not heroic in any way, by way of her gender, her sex. Most heroes in the Bible are men. She's not heroic by way of her family. We don't know anything about her family. She's not heroic in any way except for the fact that God decided that she would be the hero of this story. And her heroic acts are not grand. They're not extravagant. They are not in some way miraculous or unexplainable. She's not a miracle worker. She's not a great orator. She is completely unheroic, but because she submits to God's will for her, she is the hero of this story. And some of you think that there's no way that God could use you. Some of you think that because of who your parents are, God couldn't use you. Some of you think that because of where you live, God couldn't use you. I mean, could something good come from West Columbia? Some of you think that because of your financial situation or because of because of something about you, you think, God could never use that. And I want to tell you that He can. He can. You don't need to work miracles for Him to use you. You don't need to be a great orator or very accomplished. You don't have to have some sort of amazing skill for Him to use you. You must have the character trait and the quality that Hadassah had, though, and that is a willingness to obey. Submission to the will of God no matter what. See, what we find in the people God uses are people who would say, as we just sang, it's all about Him. It's not about me. God doesn't need to figure out how I would do it. I need to figure out how God's doing it. And that's what we discover in a very humble girl who happens to be very, very beautiful. So we're not going to read all of Esther 1 and 2, because then we would just read it and go home because we'd be out of time. We are going to read parts of Esther 1 and 2. And so I want you to see the occasion for Esther's inauguration into a position where God will use her. So in Esther 1, we find that Xerxes, that is Ahasuerus, is throwing a feast. It's a week-long banquet, and there are no limits to the party. In verse 8, it says the drinking was according to the royal decree, and the royal decree about the drinking was there are no restrictions. So for 7 days, the king declared to the people that you should party without any restriction at all, especially when it comes to drinking wine. So all of the wine of the kingdom is open, and the best wines are coming to the king. He says he ordered all the wine stewards to bring the king, and it says the queen, her name is Vashti, is also having a party, and she's having a feast for the women in the palace. So the men are feasting in one place, and the women are feasting in the other place. Everyone is feasting, but the men look around and realize we're feasting and partying and enjoying ourselves without any restrictions, but there's no women. So, at some point, men do enjoy being together and having a good time, sometimes more than they should. But at some point, most men would enjoy the company of a woman, and so the king decides they should have at least one woman there, and so he summons Vashti. It says he sends the eunuchs to bring her, and to bring her with the crown. It says in verse 11, he wanted to show off her beauty to the people and the officials because she was very beautiful. Now if you read this and you think, that's kind of creepy, that's how you should read it. The queen is an ornament to the king. He is not a godly man. He's actually quite ungodly. If he had any sort of faith, it would have been Zoroastrianism, which is some sort of deism, but nothing like Christianity, nothing like, well, obviously Christianity did not exist yet, but nothing like Judaism. And for the most part, what we see among the emperors of Persia is though they were among that culture, none of them would have been observers of that type of religion. He's a wicked man, this king. And you are supposed to feel like he's a wicked man. That's how you should feel right now. What type of husband would call his wife to wear only her crown at his party so that everyone could observe her beauty? What type of man would do that? I'll tell you what type of man would do that. A wicked man. And the queen does not want to be paraded. She doesn't want to be ogled. So she refuses. Good for her. Verse 12, it says the queen refused to come at the king's command, the command that was delivered to her by the eunuchs. The king became furious and his anger burned within him. So now we're going to learn something that is important for the story about a decree from the king. And what we find in Esther 1 and then again in Esther 2 is we're laying a foundation of many details of this story that if they weren't told to us, then none of the rest of it would make sense. And one of the things that we're told is about the decrees of the king. Go to verse 15. The king asks, according to the law, what should be done with Queen Vashti, since she refused to obey King Ahasuerus' command that was delivered to her by the eunuchs? Continue just reading. Memucan, he said in the presence of the king and his officials, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but all of the officials and peoples who are in every one of King Ahasuerus' provinces. For the queen's action will become public knowledge to all the women and cause them to despise their husbands and say, King Ahasuerus ordered Queen Vashti brought before him, but she did not come. Before this day is over, the noble women of Persia and Media who hear about the queen's act will say the same thing to all the king's officials, resulting in more contempt and fury. If it meets the king's approval, he should personally issue a royal decree. Let it be recorded in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be revoked. Vashti is not to enter King Ahasuerus' presence, and her royal position is to be given to another woman who is more worthy than she. This decree the king issues will be heard throughout the vast kingdom, so all women will honor their husbands from greatest to least. And the king and his counselors approved the proposal. So the worry of his advisors was, what will our wives do? If the king's wife doesn't have to obey him, then our wives won't feel like they have to obey us. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to issue a decree so that everybody knows the consequence that has fallen on Vashti. So if here's the thing. If a Persian king issued a decree, it could not be changed. There was no way to change it. It was irrevocable. So the king's word was irrevocable. So whatever he said, it lasted. There was nothing you could do to change it. The king couldn't come back later and say, oh, I changed my mind. No, once he made a decree, his mind was made, and so was everyone else's. They had to follow it. So the decree was that Vashti could never enter his presence again. That's one part of it. And the second part of the decree was another woman would replace her. So that's the decree. What were the implications in the minds of these men to the women of the kingdom? If you refuse your husband, you will be replaced. Rightfully replaced in their minds. So that it is established here that the culture of this kingdom was that the wife is a possession of the husband who must obey. This is where Hadassah lives. This is the kingdom she's in. And I know many people romanticize Esther, and we want to think positively of the king because he does have some positive traits that come out later. But our stomachs should be wrenched. Our mind should be turned toward this kingdom is a wicked one. It views the relationships between men and women wrongly. This is not the right way. The woman is seen as a possession. The queen is a possession of the king. She should be able to be flaunted at his beck and call. And when she won't, she's out and she will be replaced. So now enter Hadassah. So because of this, they make a decree that there would be a search among the kingdom of all the beautiful young ladies, beautiful virgins, that they would all be brought to the king. So the most beautiful women in the kingdom would be brought before the king, and then he could decide which one was his favorite. And the Bachelor is nothing new. This is the original Bachelor. Except the women did not come there according to their own will. They were forced to come. So if you go down to chapter 2, verse 8, it says, when the king's command and edict became public knowledge, and when many young women were gathered at the fortress of Susa under Heggai's supervision, Esther was taken to the palace into the supervision of Heggai, keeper of the women. The young woman pleased him and gained his favor, so that he accelerated the process of the beauty treatments and the special diet that she received. He assigned 7 hand-picked female servants to her from the palace and transferred her and her servants to the best quarters. So here we have Hadassah. She's known as Esther. If you go back to verse 7, it says, Mordecai was the legal guardian of his cousin Hadassah. That is Esther, because she had no father or mother. This young woman had a beautiful figure, was extremely good-looking. When her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So here we have Esther, who's extremely beautiful. Hadassah, she has a nice figure, and she's extremely beautiful. She's brought, and the king says, yeah, she's one of the best ones. So he gives her special treatment. Don't you love the special treatment that she gets? Beauty treatments and a diet. This is like every woman's, dream. That's what you want, isn't it? Your husbands now know what to get you for Christmas. Beauty treatments and a diet. I mean, how ridiculous is this? Like, if somebody cuts that out of the video, I'm going to look like the biggest misogynist that's ever lived. No, obviously she's not pining after beauty treatments and a diet. The king wants her to look the way he wants her to look. And so he assigns 7 servants to mold her beauty and to make her look the way he wants. But Esther had to keep who she was a secret. It says that in verses 10 and 11. Or in 10. And then in 11 we see Mordecai, her cousin, is looking out for her. Mordecai, it says, every day Mordecai took a walk in front of the harem's courtyard to learn how Esther was doing and to see what was happening to her. So Mordecai is her guardian, and he takes his job seriously. So now we see this presentation in this very brief verse of 2 attitudes toward women. On the one hand, one view is that she's a possession, and her beauty is all that matters. You notice that it didn't say go survey for the smartest woman, the most gifted woman, go survey for the most athletic woman. There was no desire for any trait in the woman other than her beauty. Go look for the prettiest one. That's all that was asked. So there's this attitude in the Persian mind, she's just an ornament. She's a possession. And then we have Mordecai who says, no, she's something valuable, something that should be looked after, something that is worthy of love and care. This something is not a possession or an ornament, but something that ultimately we see Mordecai might be willing to die for. 2 attitudes toward women presented here in this very brief passage. And so the king ultimately says she's the favorite. But she's only allowed to go if the king calls. Look at the last verse, verse 14. She would go in the evening. In the morning, she would return to a second harem under the supervision of the king's eunuch Shashgaz, keeper of the concubines. She never went to the king again unless he desired her and summoned her by name. She was his new possession. So in verse 16, she was taken to King Ahasuerus in the palace in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women. She won more favor and approval from him than did any of the other virgins. He placed the royal crown on her head made her queen in the place of Vashti. The king held a great banquet for all his officials and staff. It was Esther's banquet. He freed his provinces from tax payments and gave gifts worthy of the king's bounty. The king said, "Everyone celebrate. I've found a new queen." So our temptation in studying this is to highlight this moment and think of this as the good thing that happens in the first 2 chapters of the story, but it actually is not. It actually is not. It provides a lot of background information that we need to understand the story. One, we see the king's decree is irrevocable. The other thing we see is that Esther has taken the place of Vashti, and now we understand the full process that has caused that to happen. The third thing is that we know that king's attitude toward her is more of as a possession than as a person. So we know all of that. But we also, though it's mentioned less, it's actually more important. We know that Mordecai is there watching over her. And the fact that Esther is in the palace with the king provides the setting for the most important event in chapters 1 and 2, at least as far as the development of the story. You see, Esther could have been queen of Persia, one of the queens of Persia, and made no difference. You don't know of Vashti except from the biblical record. Why? Because she was a queen of Persia that was very beautiful and made no difference. And that could have just as easily been possible for Esther. And yet God had a plan for her that was much bigger than just her being a beautiful queen. And so now I want to challenge us this morning with this. God has given many of us many good things. Some of you He's given intellect, and others He's given beauty, and others He's given wisdom and leadership skills, and others even other things, just great character traits that He has given to you. And many of you have a combination of all of those. And you've used them to build a career, and you've used them to build a family, and you've used them to have a place in society. But listen, people for generations have had their place in society based on the way God's created them and the giftedness that they have, and they've made no difference. So you've put all of your emphasis on the context of the story, the foundation of the story, the background of the story, and you've missed what God has intended to do with the context of your story. I don't know if this makes sense or not. You've developed the setting. You've developed all of the characters of your story. You've established the personality arc of the characters. You've done all of the work in writing a great story, and yet there is no great story. Why? Why? Just think if this was the end of the story. And you know, for a lot of people, it seems to be the end. Oh, Esther, she became queen. Cool. That's amazing. Look what God can do. He took an orphan girl and He raised her up to this place of influence and power. Here's what I'd say. If that was the end of the story, what would we rightfully say about it? Here's what we would say. So what? So what? So we, as a church, have worked with orphans in Kenya for years. Many of you have supported orphans financially as they go through their schooling. Danielle and I adopted Gia, and so we have been blessed to have him in our family, and I've taken him from that place where he was to now he's a part of a family where he's loved and he loves us, and it is more of a blessing than we could have ever imagined. So his opportunities that he wouldn't have had, and those children in Kenya have had opportunities they may have never had, opportunities for education, opportunities to prosper, opportunities to have a future. But what if that's all they got from it? What if they were educated, got a great job, made lots of money, and died and went to hell? What if we spent so much time building the background of a story that could make a difference, but never emphasize the thing that actually makes the difference? What good? Jesus says, what good is it for a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? What good would it have done for Esther to become queen of Persia and be useless for God? What good has it done for you to build your life, to build your story, to no effect at all? So then what? We spend a lot of time skimming through a lot of things to build a foundation, and then we get to this one act that seems almost like a side note, but it ends up being one of the most important elements of the story. And this is Esther's story. I don't want you to be confused. She's the hero. But something happens with Mordecai that sets up the whole rest of the thing. And the reason Mordecai is where he is because of what's happening to Esther. So because Mordecai loves and cares for Esther, and he's going to make sure to watch over her, he finds himself at the city gates. He's not going to leave her alone. He's not going to just hope the best for her and send her on her way. He's there. And because he's there, God's about to do something that will make sure that what God intends for this story happens. See, the obedience of Mordecai and his care for Esther as her guardian sets up a string of obedience that actually God uses to accomplish an amazing thing. You see, Esther is the book in the Bible where God's name is never mentioned. It's the only one. 66 books. The book of Esther never mentions God's name, and yet no one reads Esther and thinks God wasn't at work. What do we see is God's fingerprints on everything that happens. So you don't have to say his name in the book to know this is what God's doing. So here's Esther in this place, and this isn't about Mordecai, but Esther being in her place causes Mordecai to be in his place. And because he's in his place, God does something that he's going to use later. So look at verse, I can't see the number. The numbers are so small. I'm going to get reading glasses. I think it's because I cried earlier. It's so blurry. 21. During those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan, if you need a boy name, like your sister names their kid Nathan, and you're like, that ain't nothing. Nathan, small Nathan, I got Bigthan. You use that at your own discretion. Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the entrance, became infuriated and planned to assassinate King Ahasuerus. When Mordecai learned of the plot, he reported it to Queen Esther, and she told the king on Mordecai's behalf. And when the report was investigated and verified, both men were hanged on the gallows. This event was recorded in the historical record in the king's presence. You say, that's a pretty significant event. The event itself was significant, but the most significant sentence in that event was, this event was recorded in the king's presence. See, King Ahasuerus seems to be a lot like me. A significant thing would happen today, but he would forget that it had happened tomorrow. And so because he was like that, he said, hey, write this down. Mordecai did this. So here's what we find, is all of the people in their place, obeying God, and if we didn't already know the end of the story, we would say, what is going to come of this? What is going to come of this? What does it matter that Esther was obedient to go and be in the presence of this wicked king who had already demonstrated his wickedness? What was it that she was willing to do that and be in this place? Well, we'll know later. It's going to be very explicit why. But her being there, Mordecai says, hey, my place is to be there with her. And so because he's there, he hears of this plot, he's hey, Esther, tell the king that these two knuckleheads are trying to kill him. And the king's like, what? And they investigate, and they're like, they thought they were going to kill me, I'm going to kill them. And they are killed. And the king says, hey, write that down. Look what Mordecai did. So Mordecai, all he is just hanging out where he's supposed to be. And because he's where he's supposed to be, doing what he's supposed to do, God uses him. It seems like following Jesus is really hard. We make it very complicated. In our Sunday school class this morning, we had the most complicated lesson ever, and I made it even more complicated than it already was, just to challenge the people in the room. We can make it super complicated, but I want to offer you something that will maybe make it a little bit easier for you. What does it look like to follow Jesus? I would say it looks like long obedience in the same direction. But it's just taking the next step. Being where you're supposed to be. Doing what you're supposed to do. And then having an awareness to see what God's going to do with you there. And sometimes that looks very boring. I mean, so imagine you're Mordecai. Like, what's he doing? He's probably at the Starbucks. He's got his cup of coffee. He brought a book. He's just sitting there. He's like, I'm going to be here where I'm supposed to be. I'm watching after Esther. And God puts in front of him this plot. God says, no, because you're obedient. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. Here, I've got something really big for you to do. If you'll just be aware, just listen. Mordecai hears. He says, I know what to do with this. He goes to Esther, who's where she's supposed to be. And Esther, because she's where she's supposed to be, she tells the king. And so the king's life is saved. This event is the key to the rest of the story. If this hadn't happened, we would not know Esther's name. So was it some miraculous deed? Was it some great act of oratory? Was it something earth-shattering? No, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was simply being where you're supposed to be when you're supposed to be there, looking for what God wanted you to do when you're there. And I would argue that's what it means to follow Jesus. So, Jesus, he can use any of us, not because of who we are, but because of who he is. We have Esther and Mordecai, an orphan and her caretaker, raised up from nothing into the house of the king to be used by God. And I want to tell you, even though you may not believe it, your story is more amazing than theirs. Because in the grand scheme of things, you have less than Esther. You don't come before God with beauty and giftedness. You come before God a sinner. All of us do. Your father and mother are sin and death. And you will return to them when your life is over. And that's true for every person who's ever lived. And that's all we could ever look forward to, is returning to the care of sin and death. And Jesus, knowing that because of our sin we deserved death, he came graciously to save us from it. And he took us who had nothing to offer him, and he offered us everything. Jesus has not offered us a throne in Persia. He's offered us a throne in heaven. And everyone who believes in his name is saved and becomes a co-heir with the King of the universe, more mighty than Xerxes. You have all of this at your disposal, and his requirement of you is to be where you're supposed to be, when you're supposed to be there, and look for what God wants you to do when you're there. Could that be it? I mean, doesn't he require like amazing things of us? Don't we have to be perfect and strong and mighty? And don't we have to like demonstrate how much better God is in all of these things? Look, if you will obey him, you will do all of those things. And you may not even realize how significant it is until much later. There was a shoe salesman in Chicago. He was a really good salesman. His name was Dwight, not Schrute. His name was Dwight, and a man came in to buy shoes and talked to Dwight about Jesus. And he was convicted of his sinfulness. He gave his heart to Christ. He began to search for what God may have him do. And what God led him to do was to be one of the greatest evangelists the world has ever known. His name is not just Dwight, it's Dwight L. Moody. He preached Jesus all over the world. And God used him in more ways than probably anybody could ever imagine. We know his name. We know about his life. We can read his sermons, but does anybody know the name of a guy that just needed to buy some shoes? But what was he doing? He was in the right place. He was there at the time God wanted him to be there. And he was looking for a chance for God to use him where he was. And when he had the chance, he took it. And God changed the world because of a nameless man's faithfulness. So you think God can't use you. That is a lie. God, not only can he will use you. And all you have to do to be used by God is to obey him. So that's the challenge. Will you, or will you invest all of your time in the background of your story that ultimately will not matter because you've wasted your life? Don't waste it. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your word and the challenge that it presents to us through a godly woman and a godly man. Both of them finding themselves in places they would have not put themselves on their own, and yet being there, they chose to obey you. God, let that be true of us. Thank you for saving us. Thank you for lifting us up. But let us remember that there's a purpose for us to have been saved by Jesus, and let us pursue it one step at a time, one very boring day after another. Let us pursue your purpose for our lives, trusting that you can do things that we could not do for ourselves. We thank you that that is true. We pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's